I got my own roots to water, got my own family tree, got my own set of heroes that mean something to me. I got my own road to travel, my own story to tell. Still I'm connected to you and everyone and everything.
The roots of what you do are with the other people. The roots of what you do are with the other people. Now, the late, great Charles Nelson Reilly heard that adage for the very first time in Uta Hagen's 11 a.m. Tuesday morning beginning acting class at the HB Studios in downtown New York City in the early 1950s. You see, in those days, if you wanted to be an actor, you did something that is completely unheard of today. You studied. And there were a number of good schools where you could learn the craft. I mean, there was the Neighborhood Playhouse with Sandy Meisner, the Actors Studio with Lee Strasberg, the Royal Academy of the Dramatic Arts, which I don't know who was there. But they all cost a lot of geld. And meanwhile, downtown was this new studio, the HB Studio, started by the European director Herbert Berghoff and his wife, the First Lady of the American stage, Miss Uta Hagen. And there, classes were only $3. And if you didn't have the $3, Pippa Hastings, the registrar, would say, just go on in. Yeah, just go on in anyway. And so in they went, 22 eager young hopefuls, all sitting there, waiting for Miss Hagen to call the roll. Good morning. Mason Adams, Jack Albertson, Barbara Berry, Orson Bean, Shelley Berman, Peggy Cass, Wyatt Cooper, hello, Robert Culp, Charles Grodin, David Hedison, Bill Hickey, Hal Holbrook, okay, Harvey Korman, Frank Langella, Jack Lemmon, Steve McQueen, Annie Mira. Hi, Annie, how are you? Geraldine Page, Charles Nelson Reilly. Here, Miss Hagen. Jason Robards, Jerry Stiller. Jerry Stiller? Don't stand in the back, Jerry. There's a seat right here next to Annie Mira. Annie, raise your hand, would you? Tom Troop and Fritz Weaver. This group that would go on to make millions of dollars and win hundreds of prestigious awards and, in many cases, become household names. That morning, in that class, they still all had three things in common. One, they all wanted to be on the stage. Two, they all had no money. And three, they all, not one of them, could act for shit. Ram Dass says that we're all walking each other home. And I believe that on our walks, which are hopefully very long, but not too steep or too rocky, we're going to meet all kinds of different people, some of whom we'll wish we hadn't. And every once in a while, in a blue moon kind of way, you will encounter that extraordinary person. That person that the very meeting of changes your course in life forever. That person who you literally incorporate a little bit of and take with you wherever you go. That person that is literally a building block for what you are in the constant process of becoming. We all have them. You can't look for them. They come when they do. And Charles Nelson Reilly was one of mine. He was my director. He was my actor. He was my co-author. He was my collaborator. He was my mentor. And most importantly, he was my dear, dear friend. And together, we cobbled together and created his celebrated solo one-man play, Save It for the Stage. You know, when I asked Charles in a rehearsal, why do you want to call our play that? He said, well, you know, when I was a little boy, whenever I would ask my mother anything, she would always say, save it for the stage. If I said, why does Daddy sit backwards in the bathtub with his back to the faucet, Ma? Save it for the stage. Why doesn't Mrs. Ellis talk to you in the elevator anymore, Ma? Save it for the stage. I never knew what stage she was talking about. But now, I think it makes for a very good title. Charles Nelson Reilly was born in the Bronx on January 13th, 1931, the only child of Charles Joseph Reilly and Signa Avira Nelson. His father was a mild and meek-mannered man who did the outdoor display advertising for the movies. He was very well liked in the neighborhood. His mother, on the other hand, yelled out the window a lot. Hey, you Dago wops, you get away from my boy. Jews, yeah, you Jews, you with the funny hats, get away from my kid. She wasn't very well liked in the neighborhood, and she said terrible things to Charles. Like when he was a little boy, she once said to him, I should have thrown away the baby and kept the afterbirth. And Charles always said that was a good day. And whenever she went to get her hair done, she'd take a baseball bat with her. She walked down Webster Avenue for fear of being lynched by a mob of angry housewives before she could even get her head under the dryer. But when she was gone, Charles was alone to play with his puppet shows. He was doing Cinderella of the Bronx. It was a musical. It was on ice. It was spectacular. Now, Charles' father didn't really know how to feel about his only son playing with dolls. So he'd say, Chuck, why don't you go out and throw a ball around? Well, Charles couldn't see the ball because his eyes were bad. And stickball is a very fast game in the Bronx. And every time Charles got up to bat, two unemployed construction types in the second and third story window would lean out and go, Mary's up! But when he was 7, his mother finally did something really wonderful for him. She took him to the movies. She took him to see Naughty Marietta with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. They grabbed their baseball bat, and up Webster Avenue they went, and over to the Grand Concourse. And there, to their ultimate destination, was the Loewy's Paradise, this palace built for the cinema. It incorporated an entire city block. And when his mother pushed open those wooden doors, those heavy doors for the first time, Charles felt that plush carpet under his feet and the luscious draperies that were all around. And then they went to their seats. Don't drop the baseball bat, Ma. Oh, Ma, look at the ceiling. Look at the sky. Look at all those clouds, Ma. And then the flicker of the image on the screen. And a little voice in Charles's head spoke to him for the very first time and said, this is a place for you. This is a place for you. When he was in the 4th grade, he got cast in the lead in the school play. Yes, he was going to play Columbus in Columbus the Man. He raced home to tell his mother, well, you're not going to be in a play. Who do you think you are, Oscar Homolke? Listen to me. You're sick, you're weak, and you're on beef broth. And I'm going to go up to that school, and I'm going to tell that Dago teacher plenty. She was always telling everybody plenty. So they grabbed the baseball bat and up Webster Avenue they went to PS 71 to tell Miss D. Benedetti plenty. Now, Charles might have only been in the 4th grade, but he knew that Miss D. Benedetti was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his life. Her black, curly hair fell in ringlets around the lace collars of her silk blouses. And she had lake blue eyes. And when she spoke, you swore you could hear music. Mrs. Reilly, I'm so sorry to learn that Charles is sickly and weak and on beef broth, and that his eyes are so bad. But Mrs. Reilly, I've had this script, Columbus the Man, in my desk for 14 terms now, just waiting for a boy like your Charles to walk through that door. Mrs. Reilly, I know he doesn't have the necessary countenance or masculinity of Columbus the Man, but still, I have to tell you that in my 17 years here at PS 71, your son Charles is truly the only gifted actor I've ever had in any one of my classes. Well, now his mother didn't know whether to shit or go blind. I think that's an old French theater term. But anyway, he got to do the play, and they had 6 weeks of rehearsal on the big stage. Oh, the choreography was incredible. I mean, getting all those fourth graders to walk on a ship like it was on an open rolling sea, it was very complicated. And then opening night came, and the kids had painted a huge backdrop that had the sea and the clouds and the birds, and Otto, the janitor, had wheeled out a ladder and put it on the stage, and at the top he had attached a basket for the crow's nest. And as the play unfolded, when it was time for his boatswain, Fritzy Seligman, from over on Nordson Street, to go up to the mast, he climbed the ladder to the top to spy for land. And in that historical moment in time, his boatswain said, "Columbus! Columbus!" He had terrible sibilance. Plus, he just had braces put on his teeth by Dr. Hebner. "Columbus! Land ho!" And then Columbus the Man came down center and put his boot up on the bow of the ship. He had a black crepe paper costume on with 2 silver stripes. His mother had made 2 just in case he wet himself. And he said, "I, Columbus the Man, declare this land for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And furthermore, I, Columbus the Man, on this day in history have proven that the earth is indeed round." Blackout. Oh, when the lights came on, you should have heard such applause. I mean, there were a lot of grandmothers in the audience, and little Charles was bowing away like crazy. And then suddenly the little voice in his head spoke to him and said, "You know, you're really good in this." I mean, it was like he was Meryl Streep watching the rushes to Sophie's Choice or something. And as he's bowing away, he looked up to the follow spot, because that's where Miss Di Benedetti was, because she didn't trust that job to anybody else. And she stood there beaming with pride, and tears were running out of the corners of her lake blue eyes. And in that moment, in PS 71, an actor was born. Right after his theatrical triumph, Charles's father had a great opportunity come to him. A man in a very natty 3-piece suit, well cut, fine fabric, with a little pencil mustache, came to his office and said, "Mr. Reilly, I'm starting a company in California, and I've been a fan of your watercolor work for years. You are truly one of the finest watercolorists in all of the city. And we're going to be doing work in color in California, and I would like you to come with us." Well, Mr. Reilly was so excited. I mean, the thought of the palm trees and the warm weather and this opportunity, so he raced home to tell his wife, "We're not going to California. What are we, pioneers, gold diggers? My roots are in the East, Reilly. This is where my family is. Give up your big ideas. You're never going to have anything. Give them up, Reilly." So Mr. Reilly had to say no to the palm trees and the warm weather and a future. Oh, wait a minute. It's that time in my show, which is only a show, to do the game show section of the show. Because really, what show about Charles Nelson Reilly would be complete without a game show, right? So tonight, you, the audience, actually have a chance to win an actual prize, all right? You ready? And to show you the prize is my stage manager and assistant, Nicole, Millar. You'll see, yes, very good. Now, this is a very valuable original commemorative Chips coin. It features my likeness from the series back in 1980. And on the other side, if you look closely, is a hand-etched, beautifully drawn Kawasaki 1000, the exact motorcycle that I rode in Chips, the NBC hit show. Thank you very much. This coin, thank you, Millar. By the way, yes, this was fashioned by Bob Shamus, and it's yours to win if you can answer this question. Are you ready? Please, don't all blurt out. We don't want to rally. I just want you to raise your hand if you know the answer to this question. Who was the mustached man that invited Charles's father to go to California? You have about 10 seconds. Up.
Walt Disney.
Yes, you won a prize, my man. There you go. Congratulations. Please, the value of that coin is unknown. That's right. Check on eBay. But anyway, yes, the man was Walt Disney. You know, Charles always used to say to me that when his parents were discussing the possibility of Charles Sr. taking this job, his mother would scream at him in the apartment at night, "Who's gonna listen to a mouse that talks?" Only the whole world, Ma. So when Mr. Reilly said no to this opportunity and no to a future, ironically, right at that point in history, the nature of advertising for the movies shifted 180. They went away from the hand-drawn art and they went to the photograph. And Mr. Reilly was suddenly without any work at all. And he talked about how he could remember that moment when he sat in his office and he could hear the razor blade on the glass door as they scratched away his name and they scratched away his life. He got very depressed. He started to drink heavily. He had a nervous breakdown and he had to be institutionalized. Well, Charles's mother couldn't handle the responsibility in the apartment and all that, so they had to move up to her family in Hartford, Connecticut. Charles always talked about that train ride to Hartford, how his mother sat on the train with a broken potted plant in a little paper sack, and how she repeated a mantra as the wheels turned on the tracks in this eerie synchronicity. What's going to happen to us? 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 Hartford! And so they arrived at the station and they went over to their new digs. 16 Enfield Street, a 2-room, cold water flat on the 3rd floor that already had 5 adults living in it. Now, the best way for me to describe the Reilly household would be to set the dinner table for you, okay? So first of all, you had at one end his father, who was ultimately released from the institution, but who remained sedated at all times. Next to him, you had Charles's Aunt Lil. Now, Aunt Lil had been a nurse at the Children's Hospital in New York. A doctor had seen that she was having some back pain. When he asked her about it, she said, "Yeah, doctor, it's really quite painful." He said, "Well, you know, Lil, there's a new operation, and we can take away all that pain." So Lil volunteered to have one of the first ever lobotomies. It didn't work. So you had his sedated father and his comatose aunt, and then you had his Uncle Bert, who was this very dapper man who would eat his dinner really quick. He'd get dressed up for dinner, and then after dinner, he would sit in the easy chair under the lamp and he'd read the papers. But he wasn't looking for entertainment venues or social clubs. No, he was reading all the funeral notices and obituaries, trying to find out where that evening's viewings were going to be held. And then he'd throw on his mackinaw and he'd go out and he'd sit among the dead. People that he never even knew. Charles always said that his Uncle Benny was the only one in the family with an active social life. And then you had his 2 grandparents, Otto and Inga, who were old school Swedes. They spoke no English, and while everyone else was eating fish sticks because Birdseye had just come into view, they wanted the old school herring out of the jar with the head and the tails and the bones and the stink. They finish a piece, they throw the remnants across the room and into the toilet and never miss. And everybody was speaking Swedish. Eugene O'Neill couldn't have gotten near this family. Charles Nelson Reilly spent his adolescence in an Ingmar Bergman movie But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was he was out in the yard one day and he heard the two washerwomen next door hanging the wash on the line. And one of them said, Stella, come here quick. Stella, don't you think that Mrs. Reilly's son is odd? Can you imagine being a coming-of-age young man and being referred to as the odd one in a family like that? But thank God he made 3 lifelong friends. First, there was Paul Tresky. Now, Paul was a big guy, barrel-chested. He was very large for his size, and he had a very deep voice. And he loved to act. And because of his voice and his mien, he got all the leads in the school plays. Well, Charles told me once, in all confidence, that in his 50-plus years of television, film, stage, voiceover work, acting classes, that Paul Tresky was the single worst actor he'd ever met in his life. However, Paul had a mom, Mrs. K. Tresky. And Mrs. K. Tresky was this little powerhouse of a woman with a pillbox hat. She was a short little thing. And he always said that when she walked up Main Street with her purse over her shoulder, you knew that she meant business. And she owned a local movie house, so they could get in for free, he and Paul. So one day they're at the movies. Paul is downstairs. And Charles is sitting in the office with Mrs. Tresky. And she says, Charles, you're going to be an actor, not Paul. Ooh. Paul loves it, but Paul doesn't have it. But you have it. And I am telling you, as I am K. Tresky, one day I will live to see you on Broadway. Not Paul. And then there was Donald Baggish. Now, Donald Baggish, his parents owned Baggish Bakeries, which had the best rye bread in town. And one day he came over with 2 tickets to go to the Ringling Brothers and Barnum & Bailey Circus that hot summer afternoon. Well, Charles was going that night with his father, so he was really excited about the idea of going twice in a day. So he went home to tell his mother, you're not going to the circus twice in a day. What are you, a carny? A roustabout? Listen to me. You're going to the circus tonight with your father, and that's enough. So being an adolescent, they went anyway. As they walked up Enfield Street, Charles said you could hear his mother because she came out onto the porch and yelled for the entire neighborhood to hear, I hope it burns to the ground. Oh, you'll like her, Donald, once you get to know her. She's really very nice. And then they got to the circus. Now, they didn't have actual seats. They had end seats, which meant they could sit on the bleachers on that side or the bleachers on that side. They started to go over here, but then Charles saw a seat over there. Come on, Donald. And they raced over and they got up to the top of the bleachers and they sat down, and the crack of the whip and the sawdust and the smells and the lions and the tamers and the clowns and the music and the popcorn. Oh, Charles was in heaven. And then the greatest act in the circus was about to happen. The Flying Wallendas. They were going to be up on the high wire. Nothing would happen in the 3 rings under them because they were the main attraction. And as those acrobats in their yellow costumes ascended that ladder with the bicycles over their shoulder, just as the lead one got to the top, Donald looked across to where they had almost sat a half hour ago and saw this huge ball of flames and yelled, fire! And they got up and they raced to the end of the bleachers and they climbed down and they went under the tent. And then they ran and they ran and they ran and they turned around and it was gone. The whole tent was gone. All that remained were 3 charred poles. It was a scene of absolute bedlam. Emmett Kelly, the world-famous clown, ran by with an empty bucket of water. A little girl whose face was melting. She was literally on fire, was screaming, my mother's going to kill me, my mother's going to kill me. The band was playing the Marine hymn because that's what you do in an emergency. You see, Ringling Brothers and Barnum & Bailey had waterproofed the tent. See, because they didn't want to have to give back the gate if they got rained out. And the formula they used to waterproof it was 1,600 pounds of paraffin and 5,000 gallons of kerosene. It was a formula that was generally used. They never cared about fireproofing the tent. 168 people died in that fire that day. It changed Charles forever. He always had a sort of a PTSD. He could never be of an audience. He could never, when he directed me in a play, he would direct from the side or on the stage. He couldn't sit in an audience. Donald Baggish, he never told anyone what Charles's mother had yelled from the porch that day. He was a really good friend. And that night, Charles's mother and father had the worst row of their life and never spoke again. The last friend I would like to tell you about is Schwartzy. Like Charles, Schwartzy was a tall guy, and like Charles, was a bored 13-year-old who was desperate for something to do during the summer. So the two of them went to the Bushnell. They put on their best suits, and they passed for 15 and got hired as ushers. Within a short amount of time, Charles thrived in his position, and he became the head usher of the Bushnell, a 3,000-seat theater where all the big shows and road companies would come through. And from his vantage point and his special perch on the first mezzanine with his flashlight at his side, he oversaw his entire kingdom. And it was from that vantage point that Charles heard something for the very first time in his life. The sound of 3,000 people laughing as one. There wasn't any laughter in the Reilly household. And the voice in his head said, "You've got to learn how to do this, Charles. You've got to learn how to help people forget their troubles and their problems and their ailments long enough to laugh." And so it was that motivation that drove Charles to New York City in the early 1950s and into Miss Hagen's 11 a.m. Tuesday morning class. He attacked off-Broadway in the 50s with an incredible vigor. He did 22 off-Broadway musicals, all of them flops. Walter Kerr wrote of one, "If I see Charles Nelson Reilly's young, energetic face in one more opening number, I am going to be sick." In 55, through a friend, he got an audition with the head of casting at NBC. It was a big deal. This guy was an important person. They were getting into live television and they wanted real good talent. So he went to this high-rise building in Manhattan, up on the 55th floor, where this big maca behind a big mahogany desk in a corner suite sat, doing his work as the secretary led young Charles in for his big meeting. The man continued doing his work, and then after a moment, he took a glance at Charles. And he went back, and after a long beat, he said, "They don't put queers on TV." It was a very short meeting. Charles retreated to the lobby of the building, and he sat on this leather couch, and the little voice in his head spoke to him very clearly, and it said, "This man's words are not accurate." He always told me that it didn't bother him. No, what bothered me was when I got home from that meeting, finding that the roaches had gotten into my minute rice and that there was no dinner. This was a group of actors who were coming up the hard way. They were starving. They were known to sell their own blood in order to buy theater tickets to support other class members when they got cast in plays. That was a group that was all in. In 58, Uta made Charles a teacher. She gave him an 11 a.m. Thursday morning beginning musical comedy class, but he would never sit here where Miss Hagen sat, because this was where the teacher sat, and he couldn't accept the fact that he was a teacher. I mean, even though he went on to become a very celebrated teacher, he taught Lily Tomlin, He taught Bette Midler. He taught Gary Berghoff, Kim Chase, and Renee Fleming, our great voice, who he also directed in 2 operas. 1960s, The Great White Way opened its doors to Charles, and he did 5,000 performances on Broadway. First, he was in the original production of Bye Bye Birdie. Then he was in the original production of How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, for which he won a Tony for Best Supporting Actor in a Musical. He was in the original production of Hello, Dolly. He always said, he said it was like this by the end of that, but it ran almost 3 years, and he always gave it credit for getting his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, which is where he set. Late one Sunday night, one early Monday morning, 1:30. He's sitting there, he's having a drink, he's watching an old movie on a black and white television, and the phone rang. It was Cy Feuer, a producer, calling from Detroit in the wintertime with a musical that was in trouble. It seems that afternoon, after the sold-out preview performance, their leading man, Victor Spinetti, had decided that he no longer wanted to be in the show, he no longer wanted to be in Detroit, and he no longer wanted to be in the United States of America, and was leaving the country. This was a problem for the producer because on Tuesday night, they had 3,000 people already sold, waiting for a show that didn't exist because there was no leading man. So they had less than 48 hours to find a replacement. He begged Charles to come to Detroit in a winter to a musical that was in trouble. Charles was a mensch, so he went. And in 27 hours, fueled by Chinese food and a lot of black coffee, he had learned the libretto, the book, he had learned all the blocking, the backstage moves, he was costumed and ready for his 1:30 Tuesday afternoon run-through with his leading lady, Miss Julie Harris. Now, Charles loved Miss Harris because he had seen her in the movie Remember the Wedding. She had a scene by the porch light, and the moths were all clinging to it, and she would say, "Why don't you fly away, be free?" That meant so much to him, and he was so anxious to work with her, so he was determined to be good. So the moment came for his entrance. He was off stage. He was wearing his military outfit. He had a sword and a sash. Well, don't look so surprised. He had played Columbus the Man. Anyway, so out he came. Now, maybe it was his gait. Maybe it was his height. Maybe it was the twinkle in his eye. But when he delivered his first line, Miss Harris absolutely blanked. She didn't know where she was. She went up. Charles knew this was his moment to strike. So he went down to the edge of the stage and he leaned over the footlights and he said, "Cy, where did you get her? Come on, I have to have my cues picked up. I have a change to make. Come on, people, let's get this together." Now, Miss Harris was standing there thinking, my God, I heard he was off the wall, but this guy is nuts. Well, they got through the first act and they went up to their dressing rooms for the intermission. Miss Harris led the way. And after a moment, she emerged from her dressing room. She had a bottle of champagne, and she came to Charles, and she said, "Charles, this is for you. I think we're going to be okay." The famous American humorist Larry Gelbart once said that if they ever did find Hitler alive, the only just punishment would be to send him to Detroit in the winter to a musical that was in trouble. But Charles would take great umbrage with that because he went to Detroit in the wintertime to a musical that was in trouble, and he met his creative soulmate. He directed Miss Harris in 16 one-person plays, and she was in his Tony-nominated revival production of The Gin Game, for which Charles, at age 68, was nominated for a Tony. So while they were doing Skyscraper, Miss Harris would come in all the time with poems by Emily Dickinson. She loved Emily Dickinson. And her motivation, I think, was to get Charles seduced into the idea of creating a one-woman show about Emily Dickinson. Charles got hooked. They got Bill Luce to write the play. They got Timothy Helgeson to gather the material. And together they were Team Emily. And they went ahead. They rehearsed at the Masonic Temple in LA. They previewed in Seattle, Chicago, and Boston. And by the time they got to Boston, the critics called it the theater event of the decade. You could not get a seat. I mean, they were held over. So they were very optimistic by the time they opened on Broadway. And when the curtain came down on that first performance and the audience leapt to their feet, applauding, weeping copious tears, luminaries like Otto Preminger and Lillian Gish and Maureen Stapleton were all seen just openly weeping. There was so much optimism that when they went to the after-show party at Sardi's, which was the tradition. You see, what you did is, after the play, you'd go to Sardi's, you'd sit at your table, and at about 11 o'clock, they'd wheel the televisions over so that you could watch what the TV critics had to say about your play. And then after midnight, the newspapers would come to the table, and you'd have your final verdict. Well, it's 11 o'clock, and Charles noticed that there were no televisions. So he went to find the press agent, who said, "Charles, I'm sorry to tell you, but it's not good. The reviews are not looking good, so we're not going to bring the televisions over to the table." Well, Charles went back to the table, and he was sitting between his leading lady and his playwright, and all he could think about was the F word, flop. And then the newspapers came. First, Clive Barnes in the Daily News said, "Headline, for whom the bell toils." Miss Harris is obviously looking for a vanity production to establish herself as the first lady of the American stage. It was a mistake for Miss Helen Hayes. It's an even bigger mistake for Miss Julie Harris. There is no Belle on Broadway. Boop. And that paled compared to what Douglas Watt had to say. He said, "This isn't even a play. This one-person format, it's not theater. Who wants to sit in an audience and watch an actor up there on stage talk to people who aren't even there?" If Emily Dickinson had come to my house with that same ragtag, sewn together collection of poetry, I would have told her to just leave it at the front door and run along like a good little girl. Well, they were crushed. I mean, and the play looked like it was going to go under for sure. For 2 weeks, they were really, really in doubt. There was no ticket sales. Things were flat. And then the miracle at the Longacre Theater happened. And Walter Kerr and Rex Reed came in late in that second week, and each of them wrote reviews that would change the course of that play's life forever. One called it the event of the year. And the other one did a whole feature on Miss Harris's progress as an actress, from Joan of Arc to the Belle of Amherst. Charles was so excited when he saw these reviews, he grabbed the papers and he raced to the theater and up into Miss Harris's dressing room to tell her, but she had this big shit-eating grin on her face, which meant that she'd already seen the reviews. She was half in her room, half out on the balcony of the fire escape. She had a Brownie Instamatic hanging from her neck. She was snapping pictures, because all the way up the street to the corner and then down the avenue were hundreds of people waiting in line to buy their tickets to see the Belle of Amherst. They went on to do 180 performances, and Miss Harris won a Grammy, an Emmy, and a Tony, and they all made a couple of bucks. In the late 60s, Charles had an invitation from Dean Martin to come out and do a couple sketches during a weekend on 2 different episodes of the Dean Martin Variety Show. When Charles left the New York airport, it was frigid cold. It was February. It was freezing. And he arrived in L.A. in an early afternoon. It was 75 degrees. The air was breezy. The palm trees were swaying. The air felt like perfume on his skin. And he looked around from that jetway and he went, "How long has this been going on?" And then when he realized he could make more money doing 2 episodes of the Dean Martin show over a weekend than he could in 8 months on Broadway, he redirected his career to California. He got cast in the pilot of The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. He was only supposed to be in the pilot, but Hope Lang recognized his genius and went to the producers and said, "You better keep him, he's funny." So they wrote him a regular role of the nephew. So now he was in a TV series, and he started to do the game show circuit. I mean, he literally became a game show fixture because of his wit and his quickness. And most importantly, he started to have the opportunity to sit in the most sacred chair in Hollywood, the one to the right of Mr. Johnny Carson. That's right. He did The Tonight Show 94 times. He'd made it. I mean, literally. He was a celebrity. He was a household name. He was literally living the life of Reilly. And there he was in the 1980s in Beverly Hills in his ranch home on a nice flat piece of land, 3/4 of an acre overlooking the west side with all of the shrubberies. They had a swimming pool. He lived with a wonderful husband, Patrick Hughes. They had 2 dogs, the Menendez brothers. Totally true. And then his favorite day of the week would come. Now, for Charles, that was the day the TV Guide was delivered, because he had a whole ritual. You see, what he'd do is he'd make Manhattan, he'd get his TV Guide and a pen, and he'd take them down to his sunken TV den, which is an architectural feature of those ranch houses. And he'd have a sip of his Manhattan, and then he'd go through the TV Guide and he'd circle every time he was going to be on TV that week. So one week, he's done, and he adds them up. He was going to be on TV 28 times that week. So he sipped his Manhattan, and he thought, they said they don't put queers on TV. Now I have to wonder who you have to fuck to get off. Anyway, one day he's reading his TV Guide. He's in his den, and he sees it could be a one-man show on HBO called Time Flies When You're Alive. The plot thickens, written and performed by Paul Linke. He watches it. Now, the next week, he's having his morning Joe, he's in the TV den, he's channel surfing, and he comes upon the Stephanie Edwards show. You see, in the late 80s, Stephanie Edwards had a morning show on KCAL Channel 9 from 11 till noon. And on this particular episode, I was her entire guest for the hour. Now, I don't know exactly what happened, but something clicked in Charles, and he decided that he had to meet this Paul Linke. So Charles, being Charles, did what Charles would do. He called the television station. Now, you have to understand, I don't know anything about this, right? I mean, I'm just living my parallel life. Our roots haven't touched yet. You know, in nature, there's this phenomenon, it's a biological truth, it's called inosculation. It's when 2 roots meet and grow together as one, as if they had been artificially grafted. It's called inosculation. This completes the Mensa portion of our program. Anyway, so Charles and I had not experienced this yet. So I'm in the lobby, and I am talking to my director, Mark W. Travis. We're talking about how well the show had gone, and the phone rings over in the corner, and the guard at the kiosk answers it. I'm not paying any attention to it, when suddenly the guard cups the phone and looks around the room and says, "Is there a Paul Linke here?" So I go over to the phone and I say, "Hi, this is Paul Linke. Who's this?" "This is Charles Nelson Reilly, Paul. I want to meet the man that does one-man theater better than me. Can we lunch?" So the next thing I know, about 5 days later, I walk into Adriano's at the top of Beverly Glen, and Charles is already in there. He's ensconced in this big leather booth. I mean, he's ripping the bread, he's pounding the iced tea. "What do you mean you like calamari? So fucking good." "All right, that just means there's more for me." Now, this Time Flies When You're Alive, Paul. That is a beautiful play. And I want to tell you something. The acting that you do in the chart house scene, that's Vincent Gardenia good. I'm telling you, it's as good as any acting I've ever seen. How did this play happen? So I tell Charles about the miracle of Time Flies When You're Alive, how my late wife Francesca had died, and how I was her eulogist at her memorial. A director, Mark W. Travis, was at the memorial. He contacted me and suggested I do a Spalding Gray one-man show about what I had been through. I went to the Beverly Center and watched the movie of Swimming to Cambodia and recognized that I knew how to do that one-man thing. I knew I wouldn't do it the way Spalding does it, but I knew how I would do it. And so about a year and a half later, thanks to the dramaturgical help of the great Gar Campbell and under the direction of Mark W. Travis, on October 14th, 1987, on a day that would have been my 9th wedding anniversary with Francesca, I opened Time Flies When You're Alive at the Powerhouse Theater in Santa Monica to a house full of friends. You know, I didn't realize how nervous they all were about what I was about to do. I never knew it at the time, but I heard later, they all thought, what is he doing? How can he put his grief out in the open like that for people? They were nervous for me. So when the evening ended, and I always call it a shining kind of experience, because like the snow in The Shining, I don't remember anything about the performance. I just remember this white light all around me, but I do remember at the end, because my dear lifelong friend and former catcher on the Diamond Dogs, John Ritter, took me aside in the theater, and he said, Paulie, this is your Mark Twain. I mean, you'll do this the rest of your life. And Nancy and I will do anything we can to help you make that happen. Well, the next week, with half a house of people I did not know, but with Sylvie Drake, the angel, the critic, she wrote a review that changed my life. So the next thing you know, the 6 catharsis I was going to do became 13, became a move to the Tiffany, became a year run where I sold out every Wednesday night and every Sunday matinee. HBO got wind of it. They filmed it. You watched it. And now here I am sitting with you, Charles, turning down your calamari. Well, he laughed and he said, you know, I want to tell you about the miracle of the Belle of Amherst. So he shared that story with me. And when he was done, it was a really nice feeling. I mean, we had pushed our half-finished coffees to the side. We'd leaned back. You know, we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. We bonded. We were the Miracle Brothers. And I walked out of that lunch. I didn't think anything more of it. I thought, that was it. I realized that, well, he was a really smart guy. And next to Ritter, probably the funniest person I had ever met in my life. And suddenly I realized how much his compliments meant because of his incredible background. 1990. Paul, it's Charles Nelson Reilly. I'm here at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm here with Miss Harris. I'm directing in another one of these goddamn poet plays. This one's Isak Dinesen. And I just wanted you to know that I've lost my actor in a two-hander I'm doing next month in Dallas. Would you come down and play? A chance to be directed by Charles Nelson Reilly. I called my sister and her husband, and they immediately said they would take care of my 3 children. So off to Dallas I went for 3 months to do Joanna's husband and David's wife. Now, what I want to share with you about this play was something that Charles taught us. He said that Miss Hagen says the job of the actor is bottomless. And what that means is that every time you do a performance, you go a little deeper. You find something new. But no matter how many times you do it, no matter how deep you go, you never hit the bottom. It's bottomless. According to Miss Hagen, until you had read a play, auditioned for the play, got cast in the play, had your table read-throughs, put it on its feet, had 5 weeks of rehearsal, had your texts, had your dresses, had your preview performances, and then did 8 performances a week for 8 weeks. Only then were you really ready to begin to play. When I got back on that plane to fly home to LA after 3 months, I knew 2 things. One, Charles Nelson Reilly had made me an actor, a professional actor in the theater. And 2, when I got back to LA, I was going to pursue a certain brunette that I'd met right before I left town. I mean, isn't that always the way? Yes, I had met the beautiful and talented Christine Healy 2 weeks before I was leaving town, and I was intent on wooing her. And 10 months later, in Latigo Canyon, we got married, and Charles was there. He came to the wedding, and he hadn't shaved, he hadn't showered, really. He was in his caftan, it was filthy, it had food all over it, but it didn't matter, because you know what? He kept everybody in stitches. 1999, Paul, I got your message. This is Charles. I just want you to know that I think the idea of doing your 3 plays in rep at Pacific Resident Theater is a wonderful idea. May I suggest that you call the entire program Paul Link's Time Trilogy? And I would be honored to direct your 3rd play, Father Time. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like us to do our rehearsals on my boat in the marina, the La Boheme. So I thought that would be cool. He said, I'll cook for you, you'll tell me your stories, we'll make a play. Sounded like a deal. So we're ready for our first rehearsal. I'm very excited. Ahoy, matey! So I come on the boat. Now, I have all my stories ready, I have my cards and everything. But before I can even open my mouth, Charles starts talking. He says, you know, when I was in Miss Hagen's class, one day Hal Holbrook came in with a paper bag. Now in it he has a pair of pants, he has a long coat and this crappy $3 wig on the top. So we're all wondering what it is. So I go to ask Hal what he's doing and he says, Charles, it's my Mark Twain costume. I get paid $25 a performance to do my one-man show, Mark Twain Tonight, on weekends in universities and colleges. Well, everybody in that class thought that was the stupidest thing they ever heard. Geraldine Page said, that's got to be so shitty, and they're all laughing at poor Hal. Well, of course, what none of those wise asses knew was that one day in that same paper bag with the pants and the coat and the crappy wig would also be an Emmy, a Tony, a Grammy, and millions of dollars. So Charles always told me that when he taught his students, he'd always say to them, if you want something out of this business, if you have a dream, get a paper bag and put that dream in it. And who knows if you work hard enough. So I left that rehearsal kind of frustrated because that only led him on to many other stories. And I went away, I didn't say one word. The whole day. I had an opening in 2 weeks. I was freaking out because the only way I can rehearse is by talking. That's what I do. I'm a monologist. So I said, the next time we're rehearsing tomorrow, I'm going to come in, I'm going to start talking before I sit down. So I get on the ship. Oh, by the way, he was quite a yachtsman. You'd never know that. The Coast Guard honored him. He really had blacks all over his boat. He was really good in the ocean. Anyway, so I sit down. I say, you know, Charles, when my Christmas Eve, 1971, my father was leaving my mother for another woman, and my mother was drunk, and he'd given her a 5-carat diamond ring, and she's cursing at him. Christmas, oh my God, that reminds me. Christmas in Connecticut. I gotta tell you this story. And he says, when my father was released from the institution and came to live with us in Connecticut, when the holidays would come, he would go all around the rich neighborhoods, and he'd go into their trash cans, and he'd look for premium liquor bottles, you know, where the labels were still in pretty decent shape, and he'd put them in his sack, and he'd get all these bottles, and he'd go home, and he'd put all the bottles out, and then he'd lay them, put them on the sink, he'd wash them, he'd clean them, he'd sterilize them, and then he'd go out to a liquor store and buy the cheapest shit he could find, okay? And in this elaborate ritual, he'd go home, and with his funnel, he'd fill all the bottles to various levels. And when he was done, it looked like he had a premium bar, okay? And then Christmas Eve would come, and he'd set up the card table, and he'd have the Merry Christmas cloth on it, and he had all the glasses and the ice and the bottles all set up, and he'd sit and wait for people to come. No one ever came. So he'd start drinking. And by 10 of midnight, he'd finished all the liquor. He'd knocked it all off the table. He'd knocked the table over. And the Merry Christmas cloth was on the floor. There was broken glass and ice and liquid all over the floor. And he'd get up to try to adjust an ornament at the top of the tree. And at midnight, the tree would come down. Every year, like clockwork, at midnight, tree comes down. Now, many years later, I'm living in Beverly Hills, and my mother is out for the holidays. And Hope Lang is having a holiday party. So I take my mother. I bought her a muumuu that was very colorful because she'd worn that same black dress from Lane Bryant her entire life. And so we're driving to the party, and she's complaining about the muumuu in the car because it's too tight. I can't get the sizing out. It's uncomfortable. Come on, Ma, it's a party. Just relax. And so we get to Hope's house, and I get my mom seated, and I go to get her a plate of food. And I come back with her food, and I see that she's seated between Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. So I think, she's in good shape. So I go to enjoy the party, and I run into Shirley Booth, who says, Charles, I met your mother, and you are so right. She is the worst person I've ever met in my life. And he said, I know, Shirley, but what a great part for you. So as they're coming home, the valet has just shut her door, and she turns on Charles. You showbiz people are so weird. I'm driving home thinking you were seated between Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. How weird could that have possibly been? And now we're on Sunset, we're heading west, and we're at Sunset Plaza Drive, and the light turns red, and I stop, and I'm idling. Now, at that period of time, that was where the Playboy building was. It was a 6-story building, and at the very top was a huge Christmas tree. So as they're sitting there idling, a rogue 50-mile-an-hour Santa Ana wind blows across the boulevard and topples that Christmas tree down and onto the hood of Charles's car. So he looks at this tree, and then he looks at his mother, and then he looks at his watch, and he goes, what do you know, Ma? Right on time. I'm sitting there, and I am feeling like I am screwed. I'm never going to get a one-man show out of this guy. He won't let me open my mouth. So I say to him with a little bit of pique in my voice, you know something, Charles? The truth is, you're the one who should be doing this one-man show because your stories are way better than mine. Well, without missing a beat, he says, well, I'll only do it if you direct it. Emily Dickinson said, you never know how tall you are until you're asked to rise. The truth is, I would have said anything in that moment. I was so desperate to rehearse my play. So I said, Charles, I would be honored. I would love to direct your play. Now, can we work on my play? 2 days later, Paul, it's Charles. We're going to Boca. What? What are you talking about? We're going to the Caldwell Theater, baby. We're going to do our show. What show? The show you're directing me in. We're going to South Beach, baby. Sure enough, he had arranged for us to do a series of Wednesday night performances in Boca. So I had to call Pacific Resident Theater and put my Time trilogy on pause and go down for 9 days to South Beach to help Charles create Save It for the Stage. There are 2 things I want to tell you about this experience. The first one is, opening night, you know the classic director. He comes out with his clipboard. Good evening, welcome to the call. Well, listen, I want to thank you for coming tonight, and I would like to tell you to please, this is our first preview, please enjoy the show. Welcome to Save It for the Stage. Welcome, Charles Nelson Reilly. So I go off. Now, I'm expecting Charles to go out and start the show. But no, he's making a beeline right at me. And suddenly he has me in his crosshairs and he says, are you embarrassed about our play? What are you talking about? Are you ashamed of what we're doing? Tell me. No, Charles. I mean, what are you talking about? Did you hear how you introduced our play? That's not how you introduce a play. You go out and you say, I'm Paul Link, co-author and director of Save It for the Stage. Welcome to our preview. That's how you introduce a play. You have to be proud of your work. You have to stand behind it. You have to represent what you do. That was a lesson that I never forgot. Well, we all have our favorite moments in the theater. And that night, the opening of Save It for the Stage is at the top of my list. Because for 2 hours and 20 minutes, he was a master of the craft. He made him laugh, He made them cry, and at the end, they leapt to their feet in gratitude and appreciation, giving them acknowledgement of the gift that they had been given. And when I got on that plane to fly home and go back to do my time trilogy, I knew two things. One, that I was getting to go home to my beautiful family. And two, that Charles Nelson Reilly had made me a professional director in the theater. I mean, he had opened a big door for me. And it was true, because within 2 years, I got to direct Ben Gazzara in a one-man show about Yogi Berra. So in a 5-year period, I had a master class with one of the greatest comic minds of our lifetime and a master class with one of the greatest actors of our lifetime. And this was all because of Charles. Well, we had the privilege of touring our show for a couple years. We went around the country. We had tours at the Falcon Theater, the El Portal Theater, the Cannon Theater. We played the New Conservatory Rep in San Francisco. We had a run at the Irish Rep off Broadway in New York. And we ended with a 2-night run at the new state-of-the-art Bushnell Theater, an 800-seat theater. And Charles was going to be the first performance in it to open it. It was that great story, you know, local boy made good, comes home. All his friends were there. And I have to tell you, it was the most perfect ending to that tour. I mean, it was just great. And what I want to tell you about the overall experience, first of all, I used to call it my travails with Charlie. You can't direct Charles Nelson Reilly, a one-man show that he's writing in front of you. It's gonna, it's impossible. But, whether or not the show ran 2 hours and 20 minutes as we scripted, or 3 hours and 45 minutes, as I don't know who scripted, the fact is, the audience always responded the same. They leapt to their feet with joy and appreciation and acknowledgement for the gift that he had given them. No fail, every time. But for the director, you don't want to see your one-man show that's scripted to go 2 hours and 20 minutes run 3 hours and 45 minutes. I mean, who wants to have your cousin Jack berate you because he and his wife Donna missed their train to New Jersey after a show? True story. So, and I go and I talk to him. But look, I had an agenda, I'll be honest. I wanted this to be the best show ever because I wanted people to know one thing. I wanted them to recognize the breadth of his brilliance. That was so important to me because he lived with the fact that people thought of him as just a game show guy. And he was so much more. So I felt I put all my heart in it, so I felt I had something at stake. And he was in his 70s, so his lens had turned inward. And he wasn't striving for anything. For him, every moment in that light was life. And so we'd fight, and when it got most intense, he'd always end the argument by saying, Paul, it's only a show. It's only a show. Man, I could not hear that then. But now, I think it makes for one great title. And the other much more important aspect of the tour was the men that would come to see Charles wherever we went, on the streets, in restaurants, in airports. These men of a certain age would all come up to him with gratitude and appreciation and just love, just for who he was. And then somewhere along the line, I got it. They don't put queers on TV. That's what he was told in the 50s. And in the 60s, they still weren't writing for gay parts. There were no gay parts in the 60s. But by the end of the 60s, Paul Lynde and Charles Nelson Reilly had permeated the membrane of television and started to appear as flamboyant characters on television. And by the 70s, when Charles was all over that television, suddenly that box that we all share, that goes into millions of homes all over America, with all those families, many of whom had coming-of-age young men, all watching the television and all seeing his countenance in the box and recognizing themselves in him and suddenly realizing that they weren't so all alone in this life, that maybe they weren't so odd. I really believe that was Charles Nelson Reilly's greatest contribution to this world, and one that will go largely unrecognized. 2004, I'm with my best friend, Dennis the Little Guy Redfield. We're talking about a golf game or something like that. And the phone rings. Paul, it's Charles. They're making a movie of our play. What? They're making a movie of our play. They rented the El Portal for 3 nights. We're going to be in showbiz, baby. Sure enough, 2 Midwestern filmmakers, Barry Polterman and Frank Anderson, had seen our play somewhere and decided that it really needed to be documented, and they had rented the El Portal Theater in North Hollywood, a theater that we had played. This was a big crew. There was a lot of money in this, a lot of rigging and much equipment, and first show, Charles was terrible. Really, it's the only time I ever saw him. He was, well, we didn't realize, see, there was a pneumonia that would ultimately take him, but now it was just starting to mess with him. And the first performance he gave was flat. He didn't remember the stories. It really was unusable. And then he canceled the second performance. So suddenly they have one shot to get this movie. And they call me in a desperate situation on the Friday night and said, help us, please. So I couldn't be there because I was here performing Time Flies When You're Alive in the evening, but I went over Saturday morning to Charles's house, and I went through the entire play, the story arc of each scene, set up, punchline, beginning, end, beginning, end. After 3.5 hours, I came here to do Time Flies When You're Alive, and he went to the El Portal to do Save It for the Stage. Obviously, we couldn't know it at the time. That would be the last performance of Charles's life. And as the young people say, he hit it out of the park. He nailed it. I mean, he was once again the master. He held the audience in the palm of his hands. He made them laugh. He made them cry. And when he walked off stage, they leapt to their feet in well-earned appreciation. Now, I always envied the 2 filmmakers, Barry and Frank, because they could do something with Charles because of the medium that they were working in that I never could. Edit him. 2006, Charles was very sick. The pneumonia was really messing with him. I visited him at UCLA, and then he went into hospice at home, and I was up there all the time visiting him. The truth is, I was going up to see Patrick Hughes, his husband, because if you've ever been a caregiver, it's the caregiver who really, in the end, needs the support, because caregiving can be a marathon, and he was doing a great job taking care of our man. And on May 25th, 2007, Charles Nelson Reilly's extraordinary life. And I say extraordinary because this is how he defined his extraordinary life. He said it wasn't because of his successes or the money he made or the accolades he won. No, he always said, I've lived an extraordinary life because of the people who loved me. And that life came to an end. Patrick called me and said that our Charles was gone. I remember I hung up my cell phone. I was sitting in the mission chair in my living room, and I looked out the window, and I suddenly realized that with John having died in 2003, and now Charles being gone in 2007, that my life would never be near as funny again. There was a scene at the end of our play. It should have been the end. Sorry, Charles. It was after a day of teaching. Charles would come home, he'd make himself a Manhattan, and he'd sit back and he'd reflect on the day. And he'd wonder if he'd been a good teacher. Because teaching acting, it's ephemeral, it's like vapor, it's quicksilver, it's mercurial, And he wondered if the kids looked at him and thought, what can this guy who was on Celebrity Bowling possibly teach me about acting? And then he said something that I will never forget, and it penetrated my heart in the most deep way. He said, but they don't know, Paul. is that when I sit in class with them, I don't sit alone. I sit with Miss Di Benedetti, and I sit with Mrs. Tresky, and I sit with Uta Hagen, and I sit with Herbert Berghoff, and I sit with Julie Harris and Cy Fuhr because they're my roots of what I do. They're the people who helped make me the man I was destined to be when I was born in the Bronx on January 13th, 1931. And I thought about that for a long time, and then I suddenly realized that in my 37 years of being a solo performer now, the truth is, I've never been alone up here. I mean, besides you, my perfect scene partner, I don't sit here alone because I sit with Francesca Draper, and I sit with Spalding Gray, and I sit with John Ritter, and I sit with Ben Gazzara, and I sit with my brother, Dennis the Little Guy Redfield, and I sit with Charles Nelson Reilly because they're my roots. They're some of the people who helped make me the man I was born to be. And so I would ask any of you, who are your roots? Who did you bring here with you tonight? And I would ask you to think about them and remember them and reflect on your experiences with them. See their faces in your mind's eye and say their name out loud, because isn't it our duty as human beings, while we still are inhabiting these skin suits, to honor those that have gone before us and help make us who we are? And isn't the act of doing that a way of reinforcing all of our root systems? The roots of what you do are with the other people. You see, Uta wasn't teaching them acting. She was teaching them life. Emily Dickinson. If I can keep one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life's aching or cool one pain, or help a fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. Thank you.